Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Trump's Mideast visit brought sweeping changes, but is there any hope for U.S. pressure to end Israel's policy of starvation and killing in Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. In a span of days, U.S. President Donald Trump made progress on several key issues that had been stagnant for years in the Middle East. On Syria, he met with the country's new president and promised to lift the sanctions placed on it and give it a chance to rebuild after decades of vicious rule by the Assad regime. In Yemen, he ended the U.S. part of the war against the country while excluding the Israeli part of the war. U.S.-Iran talks are still ongoing. And in Gaza, the U.S. negotiated for the release of an Israeli-American soldier who'd been held by Hamas since October 7th, 2023. But otherwise, no major progress was made toward ending the Israeli policy of starvation and killing in Gaza. So what does this tell us about the Trump agenda for the region? Today, we're talking with Matt Duss, Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy and former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Matt, so great to be with you today. Thanks for joining us. Let me just ask you to reflect on many past presidential visits to the Middle East. I'm trying to recall a visit of this importance where a U.S. president went and hung out with the Saudis, hung out with the Emiratis, went to Qatar, and somehow skipped Israel. What's going on?
Yeah, it is pretty notable. I mean, we can point to, Barack Obama's visit, the Cairo speech that he gave in 2009, that a lot of people have actually compared Trump's speech to. He, was criticized for not making Israel part of that trip. But to do a big swing through the Gulf like this, meeting with the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis, and not include Israel, especially given how much he has prioritized expanding the Abraham Accords, I think is very notable. But it does, obviously there's a lot of planning ahead of time that goes into these trips, but it is very interesting coming, as you said, after a series of moves that seem to kind of go around and cut out essentially Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel from some pretty important decisions regarding, nuclear negotiations with Iran, with an agreement with Yemen's Houthis to stop attacks on U.S. ships, but doing nothing about continuing attacks on Israel. But as you said, the question is, okay, what will that mean for getting a ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, one of the interesting new features of this terrain, and I've always known that Donald Trump, and just tell our audience, he's about the deal. He wants to do deals. He's doing hundreds of billions of dollars of Make America Great Again deals where Middle Eastern nations are going to be investing in the United States. But he's also seems to be wanting to cut a deal with Iranians. Now, we're not there yet, but we're hearing a lot of rumblings, but both sides are getting very close to some sort of deal that the Israelis have not been a big part of. And, of course, in Trump administration 1, Donald Trump suspended the JCPOA. He did a lot of things that you would put in the pro-Israel bucket. But right now, you have to argue that there's just no muscle memory from that time with some of the things we're seeing unfold now.
Right. I mean, he didn't just suspend the JCPOA, he withdrew from it. But I do think a really important difference now is that Arab governments like the Saudis, like the Emiratis, and certainly the Qataris are in a very different place, especially the Emiratis and the Saudis with regard to Iran. I mean, the Saudis were some of the biggest opponents of the Obama administration's negotiations with Iran, and they and Israel essentially were lobbying and pressing the same case. That is very much not true right now. I mean, the situation in the region has changed. You saw this Saudi-Iran détente essentially a few years ago, brokered, at least the photo op was brokered by China. But a lot of the countries in the region are taking a much different position with regard to Iran and dialing down tensions. And they do see a potential U.S.-Iran nuclear agreement as a way to continue down that path.
What accounts in your mind for this shift on Iran and the shift on Iran that seems to be unconcerned with what's going on with Israel right now?
Well, I do think there's a number of things. One is that Iran is, relatively weaker than it was some years ago. I mean, it's Hezbollah, its most important ally, has been seriously damaged. The fall of the Assad regime really it's hard to overstate the impact that that's had. That was the most important government partner in the region that Iran had. Its relationship with the Houthis continues, but that has always been, I think, more of an opportunistic relationship rather than a strategic one. But I do think you also have some of these governments, particularly the Saudis, and I do think these other governments, the Emiratis and the Qataris, tend to follow. They don't want to get ahead of the Saudis. They tend to take their cues from the Saudi government. But MBS, even though I have very serious criticisms about a lot of his policies, I do think he has a vision for the region that seeks stability, that does not seek to be permanently at odds with Iran. And I think that's reflected in the détente that took place a few years ago, and it's also reflected in their kind of support for these U.S. negotiations.
Do you think there's any chance that the Israeli leadership and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu there is learning anything from what is evolving, because they don't seem to be moving in the diplomacy direction?
Right. I mean, I think the question now under Trump, as under Biden, with regard to Netanyahu, is the same thing. Will the United States actually impose consequences on Netanyahu for blocking a ceasefire? It was abundantly clear to everyone that Netanyahu was a huge problem in Biden's efforts to negotiate a ceasefire, and yet they never would come out and say this. And I have Israeli friends who were just baffled by the fact that Tony Blinken would go to Israel time and time again and come out of these meetings with Netanyahu and declare that Netanyahu supported the latest version of the ceasefire, which everyone knew was complete nonsense. Hamas agreed to a ceasefire, but their main condition was that it's an agreement to end the war. That is something that Netanyahu still opposes. He understands that when the war ends, and that there is a real political reckoning for the failures of October 7, that would very likely lead to the end of his political career. He would very much like to forestall that. So it remains to be seen whether the Trump administration is willing to take a different approach. We've seen reports of conversations that Steve Witkoff had with hostage families where he has said, yes, Netanyahu is the main problem here. And putting the onus on him, making that argument publicly, is something that the Biden administration was never willing to do. I think that would have serious consequences internally in Israel. Would it force Netanyahu to change his behavior? I tend to think so. You can't say for sure, but again, it's something we should try for no other reason that it is true.
Do you think there's a deep rift growing between Netanyahu and Trump?
It's hard to say, but my strong sense from talking to people in Trump world is that they're really learning that Trump and Dermer, who's kind of Netanyahu's consigliere, have a real bad habit of trying to influence policy. I mean, every country uses every channel it can to influence policy and help win debates, internally. But Netanyahu is just really blatant about this. Hearing that Trump wants to do X and Netanyahu wants him to do Y, and then seeking kind of venue shopping within the administration to try and wage a policy debate internally. They're getting wind of that, Trump and his team, and they really don't like it. Now the question is, will they punish Netanyahu for that? I mean, I think we've seen clearly that they are willing to kind of leave him out in the cold on some of these other decisions in the region, but will they be willing to kind of really put the screws to him on something as close and as vital as the war in Gaza? I think that's the key question.
I've been surprised to see people like U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabe sound not like an evangelical Christian, but something more like a realist when it kind of talks about the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Words out of his mouth, worried about starvation in Gaza. Now, they've got a plan to do it. We can debate whether that plan, is operational and could work or not, but clearly not in step with the Israeli government. And I'm just not used to seeing this with U.S. ambassadors there. Are you noticing some of these same nuanced differences?
I mean, the one quote from Huckabe that I would note is where he said, the U.S. doesn't need Israel's permission. to do things. Now, that should be obvious, but it's worth him saying that because unfortunately it sometimes does seem that way, given the enormous deference that administrations, particularly the previous one, paid to Netanyahu. But, his comments on, looming starvation in Gaza, while accurate, I read as just supportive of this kind of strange and ultimately, I think, unproductive new humanitarian aid scheme that Israel and the United States have cooked up as a way to get around the existing aid.
Are you referring to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
Yes, yes. I
Tell
mean,
us
come
more.
on. I mean, yeah, no. I mean, this is a plan to help facilitate the essentially the expulsion of huge portions of Gaza's people. It's a way to kind of corral them in a specific area, to force them to travel through dangerous territory, and keep them in a place that will enable Israel to fully reoccupy and take control of Gaza for ultimately the purpose, as Netanyahu and his government officials have said publicly, is to force the migration, essentially the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of a huge part of Gaza's population. So I think hearing the language of humanitarian crisis, I think it's clear that Huckabe is saying this for different purposes.
But it does seem to me that this Middle East trip that the president just talked about didn't even kind of reference Gaza. I don't know if foreign leaders are whispering in Trump's ear, but they don't seem to be concerned about Gaza either. Arab leaders seem to have distanced themselves from the problem. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong, but I will say, I mean, Trump made reference to wanting to expand the Abraham Accords. I think he said this yesterday, hoping to get Qatar and the Saudis into the Abraham Accords. And the Saudis have made clear that they will not do this in the absence of real progress toward a Palestinian state. They made this clear to Biden. They have now made this clear to Trump. So I think the question is, at what point does Donald Trump see Israeli policy toward the Palestinians as hurting his goals? For the moment, he seems to think I can do other things in the region. Israel can continue to pummel the Palestinians and carry out this atrocious war in Gaza and essentially annex, de facto annex the West Bank, and that doesn't hurt my larger agenda. The question is, at what point does he start to think this is actually hurting my larger agenda?
What do you think the dynamics are with Witkoff and the Israelis? Because, we're reading a lot of press reports as we are, talking about this right now, where Israeli leadership is talking about Netanyahu's efforts to withstand Donald Trump's pressure. It's, again, an unusual framing around this moment. And, kind of looking at when you sort of talk about what Trump wants for the moment right now, we've also seen Donald Trump is really, ready and willing in many of the cases he's been involved with, like Ukraine and Russia, to say, hey, if you guys don't solve your problems, we're going to take our toys and go home and just withdraw entirely. Do you see that as possibly part of the game with the Israelis? Would that then, Donald Trump's frustration with the lack of compliance from Israel in getting to a different place, result in something we haven't seen, which is a cutoff of a lot of these arms shipments to Israel?
I mean, I think that would be a huge step. I think there are certainly things Trump could do short of that to demonstrate his displeasure and to really start to put pressure on Netanyahu. I don't think he would start with that. There's a huge number of ways in which the United States supports Israel. In addition to weapons, there's intelligence sharing, there's diplomatic and political support, a whole range of other things. But what Trump really does have going for him here is that he is hugely popular in Israel. And he is hugely popular, especially among Netanyahu's own base. So, while Netanyahu often benefits from pressure from presidents, Israelis are kind of like less, whether it's, Barack Obama or even someone like Joe Biden, who Israelis generally like, but is not nearly as popular as Trump is. Netanyahu can kind of respond to that pressure by saying, listen, I'm the one who's standing up for you. I won't be bullied into changing my policy. If Trump was the one saying that you're standing in the way of my agenda, you're not helping me and you're not helping Israel, hearing that message from Donald Trump could really do political damage, I think, to Netanyahu internally.
So one other part of the chessboard in the region, which was a shocker for people this week, was the meeting with Ahmed al-Sharaa, the new president of Syria, a former designated terrorist with Jabhat al-Nusra, seems to have gone through an evolution, reformed, taking the government there. And there's been, both Qatar and Saudi Arabia stepped up to wipe out Syria's debts to the World Bank, try to giving a restart to Syria. Lots of advisors, lots of influential people that have been supportive of Israel's space advised Donald Trump not to take that meeting. He said, screw it, we're going to meet. And he met, and he is now removing a lot of the restrictions and blocks on aid to Syria and support for Syria as well. That I have to tell you, for somebody watching the region, saying, these are staggeringly quick changes in posture in a very short period of time. Again, no inclusion of Israel in that decision.
Yeah, as you said, acting, completely opposite to what Israel wanted. I mean, Israel, as we've seen, they have repeatedly bombed inside Syria. Their goal is clearly to keep Syria unstable and weak. I think that's a horrible policy. It's patently illegal what they've been doing. So while Donald Trump didn't frontally, criticize that, by taking this meeting and by removing sanctions, he really is showing, listen, we want to give this new government a chance. He was effusive in his praise of al-Sharaa in a way that a lot of people took note of. But, removing these sanctions, and I think this is a good move. Let's remember, sanctions are a tool. Sanctions, were imposed on the Assad regime, I think appropriately because of its atrocious human rights abuses, its repression of its people, its a horrible war it waged on its own people. This new government under Sharaa seems to be governing in a much more equitable and a much better way. And I think a way to incentivize that better behavior is to remove some of those sanctions and say, listen, we're ready to help integrate you back into the region if you continue to govern in a way that's stabilizing, equitable, and peaceful.
Let's go back to Gaza for a minute and think about really the human nightmare of living there. If you had a family and you lost family members, you were sort of trying to find safe places there. You see now young babies, children, others, elders starving to death. Since March 2nd, there have been no shipments of food, water, or medicine into the country. There is this kind of weird plan you've discussed. There was also the U.S. promise that they were going to kind of create their own port of entry into this. I'm just wondering, Matt, from your experience, how long can this nightmare continue to simmer, to bubble, where you see a starvation used as a strategy and as a weapon of war? How long can that go on?
Unfortunately, in the absence of any real consequences, Israel has shown it will continue as long as it wants. And there's one country that can impose the costs and consequences that could change Israel's approach, and that is the United States. And I think the Biden administration's failure to do that was an absolute a catastrophic mistake that will stain that administration, will stain Joe Biden and the members of his administration connected to this policy for all time. This has been an ongoing crisis. I think it is becoming very, very acute. We saw reports just the other day of even Israeli military officials who now acknowledge internally that we are on the brink of real mass starvation. But we also have to keep in mind is that this has been the point of Israeli policy. Israeli leaders have said this publicly, repeatedly. I want us to understand this very clearly. Civilian suffering is not just, an unfortunate byproduct of this attempt to destroy Hamas. Civilian suffering has been part of Israel's strategy through various means: denial of food, denial of aid, destroying entire apartment buildings because one Hamas guy they suspect was in there. We have so much evidence for this, but I think just the fact that the crisis and of starvation is looming is starting to focus people's minds a little bit more. But again, ultimately, the only country in the world, the only government, the only leader who really can change course on this would be Trump and the Trump administration.
I'm just interested in what's going on from your perspective, to the degree you know, in Democratic circles on some of these issues. Would a Democrat ever have done what Trump did on Syria? Would they have dropped the sanctions on Syria? Would they have taken that meeting, as you kind of look at the leadership possibilities out there? Because it seemed to be a little bit paralyzed in the Democratic Party when it comes to a lot of these issues.
I want to say that a smart Democrat with actual courage and vision would have done what Donald Trump did. But again, we need leaders in the party who are willing to really take a new approach to foreign policy and not stick with these old, outdated kind of approaches. And also ones who aren't so, deathly afraid of getting criticized for it. Yes, of course. There's always, taking on these issues is tough. Washington, changing course of long-held assumptions about American power and American policy in the region takes effort. It can be politically costly. But as we saw under the Biden administration, simply doing it the old way is costly too, enormously costly. And I think the United States is going to be paying the costs for Biden's failures in Gaza for a generation. At least that is something I hear across the region and around the world. The hypocrisy, the double standard, the damage that Biden's Gaza policy did to the whole concept of a rules-based order is enormous. So I think we really, and I don't want to get any leaders in trouble by naming their names, but I do think we have some up-and-coming leaders in the Democratic Party who are willing to think differently and speak differently and act differently on these issues.
So you think there is a pulse there among the younger leaders that might come in? And I mean, I don't ask this facetiously, because you look at it, you look at how we got to where we're at, and I have to just tell you, now, I have a lot of problems and differences with President Trump, but he seems to be standing up for something. He wants to do business deals. He doesn't like conflicts and wars, and he's delivering on that. I could never have imagined a Republican president really walking that walk in the way we've seen in such a short period of time. Democrats talked a lot about that, but they did something quite different. Do you see that any differently than I do?
Well, I agree with a lot of that. And, listen, I'm not a huge Trump fan. I have real questions about what Trump actually wants to do. I mean, you always have to wonder, okay, how is this policy ultimately going to enrich Trump and his organization and his family? That's always, you always have to kind of look at that, whatever Trump's doing. But just to look at that speech he gave in Saudi Arabia, I mean, for an American president to go to that region and talk about peacemaking the way that he did, that's how I want an American president to talk. Okay, so again, I'm not taking Trump at his word. We always have to say, okay, well, show me the policy. Diplomacy is good. We should support that. But I just want to say, taking that speech just by itself, that is how I want an American president to talk. And as I've written before, the fact that the Democrats have completely left the kind of anti-war, pro-diplomacy, pro-peace lane open for Donald Trump to fill, as he did in the weeks before the presidential election. He really leaned into the anti-war lane. And again, I think we have to look with a side eye at all of this, given Trump's actual governing record in the first administration. But he really, he understood that there is a real constituency for dialing down America's military interventions, for taking a different approach globally. I would love to see a Democratic candidate or a set of Democratic candidates who also want to talk about this in a real and better way.
Well, look, whenever I speak with you, Matt, it's a real tour de force of all the issues in the region going on. I'm so grateful for your time. The Center for International Policy's Matt Duss, really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Great to see you.
So what's the bottom line? Trump's visit to the Middle East exposed a simple fact in my mind. Palestine's leadership is just invisible. There's zero evidence that President Mahmoud Abbas made any effort to raise the plight of his desperate citizens with any of the governments that Trump visited. Nor did he make public comments about the importance of resolving this catastrophe in Gaza, where more than 2 million of his citizens don't know if they're going to be dead or alive the next day. What we saw unfold before our eyes this week was the further decoupling of Arab states from genuine concern about the future of Palestine. Some may have whispered in the ear of President Trump about its importance, but Trump has made the Gaza crisis an entirely Israeli project right now, and world leaders are turning to other concerns. And that's the bottom line.